Part 1. The community center auditorium buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that always filled the air before a talent show. Parents adjusted cameras on tripods, younger siblings squirmed in their seats, and performers peeked through the side curtains, mentally rehearsing their acts one last time. It was a typical Saturday afternoon in the small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, where everyone knew everyone, and local events like this brought the whole community together. 16-year-old Emma Richardson sat in the third row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wore a simple blue dress that her mother had insisted looked perfect for the occasion, though Emma barely noticed what she had on. Her mind was entirely focused on what waited for her backstage. A piano, a microphone, and 3 minutes that would determine whether she embarrassed herself in front of the entire town or actually managed to pull off something memorable. Emma had been playing piano since she was 7, but she had never been what anyone would call a natural talent. She practiced diligently, completed her lesson books on time, and could play through most intermediate pieces without major mistakes. But there was something missing in her performances, something her teacher Mrs. Chen had gently tried to explain over the years. Emma played the notes correctly, but she didn't feel the music. She didn't connect with it in the way that made people stop and truly listen. For this talent show, Emma had chosen a simple classical piece, something well within her comfort zone. It was pretty and pleasant, the kind of music that would make people smile politely and clap at the end before quickly forgetting about it. She had practiced it hundreds of times in her living room, and she knew she could get through it without any serious errors. That was enough, she had told herself. That was all she needed to do. Sitting beside Emma was her mother, Patricia, who kept glancing at her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. Patricia knew how hard Emma had worked, how many hours she had spent at the piano preparing for this moment. She also knew that Emma had been unusually quiet all morning, barely touching her breakfast and responding to questions with single-word answers. Patricia wanted to say something encouraging, something that would ease the tension she could see in her daughter's shoulders, but she couldn't find the right words. On Emma's other side sat her grandfather, Robert Bobby Richardson, though everyone in town called him by his road name, Ironside. At 72 years old, Bobby was an imposing figure even when sitting still. He had the weathered face of someone who had spent decades riding motorcycles across the country, with deep lines around his eyes and a gray beard that he kept neatly trimmed. He wore his usual uniform, a black leather vest over a faded band t-shirt, worn jeans, and heavy boots that had walked through more states than most people would ever visit. Bobby had moved in with Emma and her mother 6 months earlier, after Emma's grandmother passed away. The transition had been strange for everyone. Patricia and her father had never been particularly close. Bobby had spent most of Patricia's childhood on the road with his motorcycle club, showing up for holidays and birthdays, but always leaving again within a few days. Patricia had grown up feeling like she barely knew her own father, and she had carried that distance into adulthood. Emma, however, had been curious about her grandfather from the moment he arrived with his single duffel bag and the framed photos of motorcycles he insisted on hanging in the guest room. She had grown up hearing vague stories about Bobby's adventures, always delivered by her mother in a tone that suggested disapproval mixed with reluctant fascination. Now here he was, living under the same roof, and Emma found herself drawn to his quiet presence. Bobby didn't talk much about his past. He helped around the house, fixed things that had been broken for years, and spent his evenings reading thick books about history and philosophy. He was nothing like the reckless biker Emma had imagined from her mother's stories. He was thoughtful, careful, and surprisingly gentle in the way he moved through the world. The only time Emma had seen real emotion from her grandfather was 2 weeks earlier, when she was practicing her talent show piece in the living room. She had been running through it for the 5th time that evening, frustrated with a particular transition that kept tripping her up, when she noticed Bobby standing in the doorway. He had been watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something that looked almost like sadness mixed with longing. When Emma stopped playing and asked if something was wrong, Bobby had simply shaken his head and walked away. But that look had stayed with her, and she found herself wondering what memories her playing had stirred up in him. She had wanted to ask, but the moment never seemed right, and Bobby had a way of changing the subject whenever conversations turned too personal. Now, sitting in the auditorium with the talent show about to begin, Emma glanced at her grandfather. He was staring straight ahead at the empty stage, his expression unreadable. His large, calloused hands rested on his knees, and Emma noticed for the first time how those hands seemed more suited to creating music than to gripping motorcycle handlebars. There was something refined about the way he held them, something that didn't quite match the rest of his rough exterior. The lights in the auditorium dimmed, and the show director walked onto the stage to welcome everyone. Emma's stomach twisted with nerves. She was scheduled to perform 7th, which meant she had about 45 minutes to sit here and slowly drive herself crazy with anxiety. Her mother reached over and squeezed her hand, offering a reassuring smile. Bobby remained still beside her, his presence solid and somehow comforting despite his silence. As the first performer took the stage, a young boy with a magic act that involved more dropped props than successful tricks, Emma tried to focus on breathing steadily. She had no idea that everything she thought she knew about her grandfather was about to change, or that her simple piano performance would become the catalyst for a revelation that would reshape her entire understanding of family, talent, and the secrets people keep hidden for decades. The first 6 acts passed in a blur for Emma. There was a dance routine performed by 3 girls from her school, a comedy sketch that got more laughs than it probably deserved, and a surprisingly good vocal performance from a shy boy everyone knew from the library. Emma barely registered any of it. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, and her hands had gone cold and clammy despite the warmth of the auditorium. When the 6th performer finished their act, a dramatic reading of poetry that seemed to go on forever, Emma knew her time had come. The show director called her name, and the sound seemed to echo through the entire building. Her mother gave her hand one final squeeze, and Emma stood on shaking legs. She smoothed down her dress, took a breath that didn't quite fill her lungs, and made her way toward the stage. The walk down the aisle felt impossibly long. Every face she passed seemed to be watching her, waiting to see what she would do. Emma had never liked being the center of attention, and now she had voluntarily put herself in a position where hundreds of eyes would be focused solely on her. She questioned every decision that had led to this moment. Climbing the steps to the stage, Emma felt the heat of the spotlight before she saw it. The piano sat at center stage, a beautiful black grand that the community center had borrowed from the high school for the event. Emma had practiced on it once during rehearsal, and she remembered how different it felt from her modest upright at home. The keys were more responsive, the sound richer and fuller. It was the kind of instrument that could make even a mediocre player sound better than they were. Emma sat on the bench and adjusted its height slightly, buying herself a few extra seconds before she had to begin. She placed her hands on the keys and felt their cool smoothness beneath her fingers. From this position, she could see the audience as a sea of faces, most of them kind and expectant. She found her mother in the 3rd row, who gave her an encouraging nod. Beside her mother, Bobby sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on Emma with an intensity she had never seen from him before. She began to play. The first few measures came easily, her fingers moving through the familiar patterns without conscious thought. The piece was Pachelbel's Canon in D, arranged for solo piano and simplified enough that Emma could manage it without too much difficulty. It was pretty and recognizable, the kind of music people enjoyed hearing even if they didn't know much about classical compositions. As Emma played, she felt herself settling into the performance. Her nerves didn't disappear entirely, but they faded into the background as muscle memory took over. She made it through the first page without any mistakes, then the second. The audience was quiet and attentive, which she took as a good sign. She was going to make it through this without embarrassing herself. That was all she had hoped for. But then, as she moved into the 3rd page, something unexpected happened. Emma's mind wandered for just a fraction of a second, and her fingers stumbled over a chord progression she had played perfectly 1,000 times before. She recovered quickly, so quickly that most people in the audience probably didn't even notice the error. But Emma noticed, and the mistake shattered her fragile confidence. Suddenly she was hyper-aware of everything, the slight tremor in her hands, the fact that she was breathing too quickly, the knowledge that she still had 2 full pages to go. Her playing became mechanical and stiff as she focused entirely on not making another mistake. The music that had sounded pleasant and flowing just moments ago now felt choppy and disconnected. Emma pushed through, determined to finish even though the joy had completely drained out of the performance. She was counting measures in her head, calculating how much longer she had to endure this. The final page felt like it took an eternity to complete, each note requiring conscious effort rather than flowing naturally from her fingers. When she finally reached the last chord, Emma held it for the appropriate length, then lifted her hands from the keys. The audience applauded, the sound warm and genuine even though Emma felt like she had just delivered the most lackluster performance of her life. She stood from the bench, gave a small bow, and walked off the stage as quickly as she could without appearing to run. Backstage, away from the eyes of the audience, Emma felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She hadn't failed, not technically. She had gotten through the piece, and most people would probably say she had done a fine job. But Emma knew the truth. She had played it safe, chosen something easy, and still managed to let her nerves get the better of her. She had proven to herself exactly what she had always suspected. She was never going to be more than an average piano player, someone who could play the notes but couldn't truly make music. Emma made her way back to her seat, accepting quiet congratulations from people she passed in the aisle. Her mother pulled her into a hug as soon as she sat down, whispering that she had been wonderful. Emma appreciated the kindness but couldn't quite believe it. She glanced at her grandfather, expecting to see the same polite approval she was getting from everyone else. Instead, Bobby was looking at her with that same expression she had seen 2 weeks ago in the living room doorway. There was sadness there, and something else Emma couldn't quite identify. It almost looked like recognition, as if Bobby had seen something in her performance that reminded him of his own experiences. Before Emma could say anything, the next performer was called to the stage. The show continued, but Emma found it even harder to focus now than she had before her own performance. She kept replaying her mistakes in her mind, wishing she could go back and do it differently. She wished she had practiced more or chosen a different piece, or never signed up for the talent show in the first place. The talent show continued with 3 more acts, each one blending into the next as Emma sat in a fog of disappointment. There was a juggling routine, a girl singing a pop song that was currently popular on the radio, and a group of kids performing a scene from a play. Emma clapped when everyone else clapped, but she wasn't really present. Her mind kept circling back to those few stumbling notes, to the way her performance had felt more like a chore than an expression of anything meaningful. When the final act finished, and the show director returned to the stage to thank everyone for coming, Emma felt a small measure of relief. At least it was over. She had done what she set out to do, even if the result wasn't anything special. Now she could go home, put this behind her, and maybe take a break from piano for a while. The thought of sitting at her instrument and practicing felt exhausting rather than appealing. The audience began to disperse, gathering their belongings and making their way toward the exits. Parents stopped other parents to chat. Performers received congratulations from friends and family, and the community center slowly filled with the buzz of casual conversation. Patricia stood and started to gather her purse, already talking about where they might go for dinner to celebrate. But Bobby remained seated. He was staring at the stage, which was now empty except for the piano and some abandoned props from earlier acts. His hands were clasped together, his knuckles white with tension. Emma noticed and felt a flutter of concern. Her grandfather looked troubled in a way she had never seen before. "Grandpa," Emma said quietly, "are you okay?" Bobby turned to look at her, and Emma was startled to see moisture in his eyes. He blinked it away quickly, but not before she noticed. Her tough, weathered grandfather was on the verge of tears, and Emma had no idea why. "I need to tell you something," Bobby said, his voice rough. "Both of you." Patricia, who had been about to suggest they head out, stopped and looked at her father with surprise. Bobby rarely volunteered personal information, and he certainly never did it with this kind of intensity. She sat back down slowly, her expression shifting from confusion to concern. Bobby took a deep breath, seeming to gather himself. He looked at the stage again, then back at Emma. "What you did up there," he said, "playing even though you were scared, even though you made a mistake and kept going anyway, that took courage. Real courage." Emma felt her cheeks flush. "I messed up though, it wasn't very good." "That's not what I saw," Bobby said firmly. "I saw someone who cared enough about music to put herself out there to risk failure in front of everyone. That matters more than you know." There was something in the way he said it that made Emma think he wasn't just talking about her performance. She waited, sensing that her grandfather had more to say. Bobby was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as if he was chewing on words he wasn't sure how to release. Finally he spoke. "I haven't been honest with you, either of you, about who I was before I became Ironside, before I spent my life on a motorcycle." Patricia leaned forward, her eyes widening slightly. "Dad, what are you talking about?" "I was a pianist," Bobby said, and the words seemed to cost him something. "A serious one. I had a scholarship to Juilliard. I was going to be a concert pianist." The words hung in the air like something impossible. Emma stared at her grandfather, trying to reconcile what he had just said with everything she knew about him. Bobby, with his leather vest and motorcycle boots and decades spent riding across the country with a biker club, had been headed to one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. Patricia looked equally stunned. "You never told me that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "All those years you never said anything about music." "I couldn't," Bobby said. "It hurt too much to talk about. Still does if I'm being honest." Emma found her voice. "What happened? Why didn't you go?" Bobby's expression darkened, and Emma saw decades of regret pass across his features. "I gave it up," he said simply. "Made a choice I've regretted every single day since." The auditorium had mostly emptied now, but the few remaining people were too far away to overhear their conversation. Bobby seemed to realize they were having this discussion in a very public place, but he also seemed unable to stop now that he had started. "I was 18 years old," Bobby continued, his voice taking on a distant quality as if he was looking back through the years. I had been playing piano since I was 5. It was everything to me. My parents weren't wealthy, but they scraped together enough for lessons, and my teacher said I had real talent. When I got the Juilliard scholarship, it felt like my whole life was coming together exactly the way it was supposed to. He paused, his hands unclenching and then clenching again. But I was also young and stupid and desperate to prove I was tough. I had this friend Danny who was into motorcycles and the whole biker culture. He made it seem exciting and free, the complete opposite of the disciplined, structured life I had been living. Classical music was all about control and precision and following the rules. Riding motorcycles was about rebellion and independence. Emma could see where this was going, but she couldn't quite believe it. You chose motorcycles over Juilliard. I chose what I thought would make me a man, Bobby said bitterly. I thought classical piano was soft, that it wasn't masculine enough. Danny and his friends made me feel like I had to pick between being a serious musician and being the kind of guy who commanded respect. So I turned down the scholarship, bought a motorcycle with money I had saved for moving to New York, and joined Danny's club. Patricia's hand had gone to her mouth. I had no idea. You never talked about music when I was growing up. I thought you had always been a biker. Bobby shook his head slowly, his eyes still focused on something far away in his memory. I buried it completely, threw myself into the motorcycle club, into that whole lifestyle. I convinced myself I had made the right choice, that I was living authentically instead of pursuing some pretentious dream. He looked at Patricia with an expression that held decades of accumulated sorrow. By the time you were born, I had been on the road for almost 10 years. Your mother, she understood who I really was underneath all the leather and bravado, but I never let myself go back to it. I told myself that part of my life was over, that I had moved on. Did you ever play again? Emma asked, her voice small. Not for years, Bobby admitted. I avoided it completely. Wouldn't even listen to classical music on the radio. It was too painful, like looking at a picture of someone I used to be and barely recognized anymore. He paused, his throat working. Then, about 20 years into my life on the road, I was staying at a motel in Colorado. They had a piano in the lobby, this old beat-up upright that was probably out of tune. It was late at night, and I couldn't sleep. And I found myself sitting at that piano like my body had walked me there without consulting my brain. His hands moved slightly, as if remembering the feel of keys beneath his fingers. I played for 3 hours straight that night. Everything I could remember, all the pieces I had learned as a teenager. My fingers were rusty, and I made mistakes I never would have made before, but it felt like coming home after being lost for decades. Why didn't you keep playing after that? Patricia asked. Her voice held a note of something that might have been accusation or might have been grief. Why didn't you tell us? Because I was ashamed, Bobby said bluntly. I was ashamed that I had thrown away something so valuable for such stupid reasons. I was ashamed that I had let toxic ideas about masculinity rob me of my passion. And I was ashamed that I had wasted 20 years when I could have been making music. He looked at his daughter with raw honesty. I didn't know how to tell you that your father, the tough biker you grew up barely knowing, was actually a failed pianist who ran away from the best opportunity of his life because he was scared of being called soft. Emma felt tears running down her cheeks. She understood now why her grandfather had looked so sad when he watched her practice, why he had seemed so moved by her simple performance tonight. He had been seeing his younger self in her, the part of him that had loved music before fear and pride had gotten in the way. After that night in Colorado, I did play occasionally, Bobby continued. Whenever I found a piano in some motel or bar, usually late at night when no one was around to hear, I never told anyone in the club. I kept it completely separate from my identity as Ironside. He gave a bitter laugh. Like I was two different people living in the same body. Patricia was crying now too, though Emma could see she was trying to hide it. I wish you had told me, Dad. I wish I had known this about you. I wish a lot of things, Bobby said quietly. I wish I had been brave enough to pursue what I actually loved instead of what I thought would make me look tough. I wish I had been there for you more when you were growing up instead of running from my regrets. I wish I had taught you piano, or at least shared that part of myself with you. He turned to Emma, and the look in his eyes was almost desperate. When I moved in with you 6 months ago and heard you playing, it brought everything back. Not just the music, but the memory of being young and having a gift and being too afraid to fully embrace it. Watching you practice, seeing how hard you work even though you tell yourself you're not that talented, it's been like watching a second chance I can't actually take. Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I'm not that good though, Grandpa. You heard me tonight, I'm just average. You're 16, Bobby said firmly. I was playing at 16 and I was technically proficient, but I didn't have any real depth yet. That comes with time and experience and living enough life to have something to say through the music. He leaned toward her, his voice intense. The difference between you and me is that you're still young enough to develop into whatever kind of musician you want to be. I gave up before I ever reached my potential. You don't have to make the same mistake. But I'm scared, Emma admitted. I'm scared I'll never be as good as I want to be. I'm scared I'll work really hard and still end up being mediocre. That fear never goes away, Bobby said. The question is whether you let it stop you or whether you push through it anyway. He glanced back at the piano on the stage. I let it stop me, and I've spent 54 years regretting that choice. Every single day, I think about what I could have been, what music I could have made, what life I could have lived if I had just been brave enough to try. The auditorium was nearly empty now. A janitor had started sweeping at the far end, and the show director was packing up papers at a table near the stage. The Richardson family sat in their row, surrounded by empty seats, having a conversation that should have happened decades ago. Can you still play? Emma asked suddenly. I mean really play. Bobby considered the question. I don't know, he said honestly. It's been 6 months since I last touched a piano and years before that. My fingers aren't as nimble as they used to be, my memory probably isn't as sharp, but the music is still in here. He tapped his chest. It never left no matter how hard I tried to bury it. Emma looked at the stage, at the beautiful grand piano sitting in the spotlight. An idea was forming in her mind, crazy and impulsive and completely unlike her usual careful nature. Play something for us, she said. Right now, please. Play something for us, she said. Right now, please. Bobby's eyes widened, and for a moment he looked genuinely frightened. Emma, I don't think that's a good idea. I haven't performed for anyone in over 50 years. I don't even know if I can still remember any complete pieces. I don't care if it's perfect, Emma said, surprised by the intensity in her own voice. I just want to hear you play. I want to understand this part of you that we never knew existed. Patricia nodded, wiping her eyes again. I'd like to hear you too, Dad. After all these years of not knowing, I want to know what you gave up, what you've been carrying around all this time. Bobby looked between his daughter and granddaughter, his expression torn. Emma could see the war happening inside him, decades of habit telling him to refuse, to keep that door closed, fighting against a deep hunger to finally share this hidden part of himself with the people he loved. The show is over, Bobby said weakly. They're cleaning up. We can't just go up there and use the piano. We can ask, Emma said. She stood up before she could lose her nerve and walked toward the stage, where the show director was still organizing papers. Bobby and Patricia watched as Emma spoke to the woman, gesturing toward the piano and then back at her grandfather. The conversation lasted only a minute before Emma returned, a small smile on her face. She said it's fine, Emma reported. The piano belongs to the high school and they're not picking it up until tomorrow. As long as we don't damage anything, we can use it. Bobby had run out of excuses. He sat frozen in his seat, his hands gripping the armrests, looking like a man about to face something far more terrifying than any motorcycle ride across dangerous terrain. Emma reached out and took one of his large, weathered hands in both of hers. You told me that watching me play tonight took courage, she said softly. Now I'm asking you to show me what real courage looks like. Show me what it means to face the thing you've been running from for 50 years. Something in Bobby's expression shifted. The fear was still there, but underneath it Emma could see determination building. He stood slowly, as if his body weighed more than it had just moments ago, and began walking toward the stage. Emma and Patricia followed, staying a few steps behind, giving him space for whatever was about to happen. Bobby climbed the steps to the stage with careful, measured movements. The janitor had moved to a different section of the auditorium, and the show director had finished her packing and left through a side door. For all practical purposes, the three Richardsons were alone in the large space. Bobby stood beside the piano for a long moment just looking at it. He reached out and touched the polished surface with something like reverence, his fingers trailing along the edge. Then he sat on the bench, adjusting it the same way Emma had, and placed his hands over the keys without touching them. Emma and Patricia sat in the front row, waiting. The auditorium was so quiet that Emma could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the faint hum of the lights overhead. She realized she was holding her breath and forced herself to exhale slowly. Bobby's hands came down on the keys, and the first notes filled the space. Emma didn't recognize the piece, but it was immediately clear that this was something far beyond what she had played earlier. The music was complex and emotional, each note connected to the next with a fluidity that made it sound effortless even though Emma knew it couldn't be. But after just a few measures, Bobby's fingers stumbled. He stopped, cursed quietly, and started again from the beginning. This time he made it further before his muscle memory failed him. He stopped again, his shoulders slumping. I'm sorry, he said, not looking at them. It's been too long. I can't remember. It doesn't matter, Patricia called out. Just play something, anything you can remember. Bobby sat still for another moment, then began again. This time he chose something different, something slower and simpler. Emma recognized it as a Chopin nocturne, though she didn't know which one. Bobby's playing was hesitant at first, his fingers searching for notes that his mind remembered but his body had half forgotten. But gradually, as he continued, something changed. His hands began to remember what his conscious mind had lost. The music became more confident, more fluid. Bobby's posture shifted, his back straightening, his arms finding the natural positions they had once known so well. The years seemed to fall away as he played, and Emma could suddenly see the young man he must have been at 18, the talented student who had earned a scholarship to Juilliard. The music swelled and Emma felt goosebumps rise on her arms. This was nothing like her own playing, nothing like the careful, correct performances she had worked so hard to achieve. This was music that breathed and lived, that communicated something beyond the notes themselves. Bobby was playing with his whole body, swaying slightly, his face showing every emotion the piece contained. Emma glanced at her mother and saw that Patricia was crying openly now, not bothering to wipe the tears away. She had never seen her father like this, had never known he was capable of creating something so beautiful. All those years of him being distant and absent, and here was the reason why, the ghost he had been running from. Bobby played for nearly 10 minutes, moving from the Chopin nocturne into fragments of other pieces, sometimes stopping and starting, sometimes playing entire sections without error. It was clear that the technical facility was still there underneath the rust, that his young talent had been very real. Emma could only imagine what he might have become with decades of practice and performance instead of decades of avoidance. When Bobby finally stopped playing, his hands resting on the keys, the silence in the auditorium felt heavy and full. No one moved for several seconds. Then Patricia stood and walked to the stage, climbing the steps and going to her father. She placed her hands on his shoulders and Bobby reached up to cover them with his own. "Why didn't you ever come back to it?" Patricia asked, her voice thick with emotion. "After you realized what you'd given up, why didn't you try to return to music?" Bobby kept his hands on the keys, his head bowed as if in prayer or penance. "I thought about it," he said quietly. "Especially after that night in Colorado. I thought about going back to school, starting over, trying to rebuild what I'd thrown away." He lifted his head and looked at his hands, turning them over to examine the calluses and scars from decades of motorcycle maintenance and road travel. "But by then I was nearly 40. I had a reputation, a life, an identity as Ironside. I had the club, the guys who depended on me, the whole structure I had built around being someone other than the kid who played piano. And I convinced myself it was too late, that I had missed my window." Patricia moved around to sit beside him on the bench, something Emma had never seen them do together. "It's never too late, Dad." "Maybe not," Bobby said. "But it gets harder to believe that with every year that passes. Every day I didn't play was another day that made it easier to keep not playing. The longer I stayed away from it, the more impossible returning seemed." He looked at Patricia with raw vulnerability. "And I was scared. Terrified, actually. Scared that I'd try to come back and discover I wasn't as good as I remembered being, that I had fooled myself about my own talent all those years ago." Emma had joined them on stage now, standing beside the piano. "Is that what tonight felt like, playing just now?" Bobby considered the question carefully. "No," he said finally. "Tonight felt like remembering who I used to be, who I still am underneath everything else. The technique is rusty, sure. I made mistakes I never would have made at 18. But the music is still there, the feeling is still there. That's what I had forgotten, or maybe what I was afraid to remember. The music itself doesn't go away just because you stop playing it." He turned on the bench to face both of them fully. "When I heard you practicing these past 6 months, Emma, it was like someone was prying open a door I had nailed shut. Every time you played, every time you got frustrated with yourself or worked through a difficult passage, it reminded me that music isn't something you either do perfectly or not at all. It's something you work at, something you live with, something that grows and changes as you do." Emma felt her throat tighten. "I almost didn't sign up for the talent show," she admitted. "I was convinced I wasn't good enough, that I would embarrass myself." "And you did it anyway," Bobby said. "That's what I couldn't do, that's what I've spent my whole life avoiding. The risk of trying and not being perfect, of putting myself out there and being judged." He stood from the bench and walked to the edge of the stage, looking out at the empty auditorium. "You know what the worst part is? It wasn't just about me. When I gave up music, I gave up the chance to share it with the people I loved. I could have taught your mother to play. I could have filled our home with music instead of filling it with my absence. I could have been a different kind of father, a different kind of man." Patricia joined him at the edge of the stage. "You're still that man, Dad. The person who played just now, that's still you. It's not too late to be that person again." Bobby was quiet for a long time, and Emma could see him wrestling with something internal. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but determined. I don't know if I can get back what I lost. 54 years is a long time. My hands are old, my reflexes aren't what they were, and I've got decades of rust to work through. But, Emma prompted, hearing the unspoken word hanging in the air. But maybe it's not about getting back what I lost, Bobby said slowly, as if working out the thought as he spoke it. Maybe it's about finding out what I can still do, who I can still be, even at 72. Maybe it's about finally being honest about who I am instead of hiding behind who I thought I needed to be. He turned to Emma with sudden intensity. I want to help you, he said. I want to teach you what I know, work with you on your playing, not because I think you need fixing or because your playing tonight wasn't good enough, but because I spent 50 years running from music, and I don't want you to spend even 5 more minutes thinking you're not talented enough or good enough, or whatever other lie that voice in your head tells you. Emma felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. I would love that, Grandpa. Bobby pulled her into a hug, his large frame enveloping her smaller one. Over Emma's shoulder, he looked at Patricia. I'm sorry, he said to his daughter. I'm sorry for all the years I wasn't there, for all the parts of myself I kept hidden. I'm sorry you had to grow up with a father who was running from himself. Patricia joined the hug, wrapping her arms around both of them. I'm sorry too, she said. I'm sorry you felt like you couldn't tell us, like you had to carry that regret alone for so long. They stood like that for a long moment, 3 generations of Richardsons finally being fully honest with each other in a way they never had before. The auditorium that had been filled with noise and performance, just an hour ago now held only quiet truth, and the lingering echo of music that had waited 50 years to be heard. When they finally broke apart, Bobby walked back to the piano one more time. He sat down and played a simple scale, up and down, listening to each note with full attention. I'm going to start practicing again, he said. Really practicing, not just playing in secret when no one is around. I'm going to find a teacher, relearn the fundamentals, work through the pieces I used to know. Why now? Patricia asked. After all this time, what changed? Bobby looked at Emma. Because I watched my granddaughter be brave tonight. Because I saw her do the thing she was scared to do, and even though she thinks she failed, she actually succeeded in the only way that really matters. She showed up. She tried, she put herself out there. He smiled, and it was sad and hopeful at the same time. If a 16-year-old girl can have that kind of courage, then maybe a 72-year-old man can find some too. The drive home from the community center was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Emma sat in the back seat of her mother's car, watching the streetlights pass by, thinking about everything that had been revealed in the past hour. Her grandfather, the tough biker she had known only through stories and his recent presence in their home, was actually a classically trained pianist who had given up his dreams because he was afraid of appearing weak. The revelation had turned her understanding of him completely upside down. More than that, it had changed something in how Emma thought about her own relationship with music. She had spent years assuming that talent was something you either had or didn't have, that some people were born to be musicians and others, like her, were destined to remain merely competent. But watching Bobby play, seeing the rust and the mistakes alongside the genuine beauty and skill, had shown her that the story was more complicated than that. When they arrived home, Patricia made tea while Bobby excused himself to his room. Emma sat at the kitchen table, still processing everything, while her mother moved around the kitchen with deliberate, careful movements. Patricia's eyes were still red from crying, and Emma could tell she was working through her own complicated feelings about what they had learned. Did you really have no idea, Emma asked, about Grandpa and the music? Patricia shook her head as she poured hot water into mugs. None. I knew he was different from the other bikers somehow, more thoughtful and quiet. But I assumed that was just his personality. I never imagined he had this whole other life before, this whole other identity he had buried. She brought the mugs to the table and sat across from Emma. I spent my whole childhood feeling like my father was a stranger, like I barely knew him. Turns out I was right, just not in the way I thought. He wasn't a stranger because he was always on the road. He was a stranger because he was hiding the most important part of himself. Are you angry at him? Emma asked. Patricia thought about it, cupping her hands around the warm mug. I don't think so. Sad maybe. Sad for him, sad for what could have been different. But anger? No, how can I be angry at someone for being afraid? We're all afraid of something. Dad's fear just cost him more than most people's do. They drank their tea in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Then Emma heard footsteps on the stairs and Bobby appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had changed out of his leather vest and was wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, looking more vulnerable than Emma had ever seen him. Can't sleep? Patricia asked. Bobby shook his head. Too much going on in my head. He looked at Emma. I meant what I said about helping you with piano. If you're interested, I'd like to start working with you. Not to replace your regular teacher, but to supplement what you're learning. I'd really like that, Emma said. When do you want to start? Tomorrow, Bobby suggested, if that's not too soon. Emma smiled. Tomorrow is perfect. Bobby nodded, then seemed to gather his courage for something. There's something else I want to do. I want to go back to school. Not Juilliard, obviously, but I want to find a music program for adults, take some classes, maybe work toward a degree even if I'm 72 years old. It seems crazy, I know, but I keep thinking that if I don't do it now, I'll be 75 and still wishing I had started at 72. Patricia reached across the table and took her father's hand. I think that's wonderful, Dad. I really do. The motorcycle club won't understand, Bobby said. They'll think I've lost my mind, that I'm having some kind of late-life crisis. I'll probably have to leave the club, give up that whole identity I've built over 50 years. Is that scary? Emma asked. Terrifying, Bobby admitted. But not as scary as spending whatever years I have left wondering what might have been. I've done enough of that already. Over the next few weeks, the Richardson household underwent a quiet transformation. Bobby contacted the local university and enrolled in their music program for adult learners. He found a piano teacher, a woman in her 60s who had performed professionally and now taught a small group of serious students. He bought a proper keyboard for his room and began practicing every day, working through the fundamentals he had neglected for decades. True to his word, Bobby also started working with Emma. Every evening after dinner, they would sit together at the piano in the living room, and Bobby would share the techniques and insights he remembered from his own training. He taught her about phrasing and dynamics, about listening to the spaces between the notes as much as the notes themselves. He showed her how to use her whole body when she played, not just her fingers. But more than the technical instruction, Bobby taught Emma about courage and persistence. He was honest about his own struggles, about the pieces he couldn't remember anymore, about the frustration of having hands that didn't move as quickly as his mind wanted them to. He showed her that being a musician wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up every day and doing the work even when it was hard, even when you felt discouraged. Emma's own playing began to change. She stopped focusing so much on playing every note correctly and started thinking about what she wanted to express through the music. She took more risks, tried more difficult pieces, allowed herself to make mistakes in service of something more interesting than mere accuracy. Her teacher, Mrs. Chen, noticed the difference immediately and encouraged Emma to explore this new direction. Patricia watched the relationship between her father and daughter develop with a mixture of joy and melancholy. She was happy to see them connecting in this way, happy to see her father finally embracing the part of himself he had hidden for so long. But she also grieved for the years when this could have happened with her, when she could have learned piano from her father and shared this passion with him. One evening, about a month after the talent show, Bobby found Patricia standing in the doorway of the living room while he and Emma were practicing. "You could join us, you know," he said. "It's not too late for you either." Patricia hesitated, and Emma could see the same fear in her mother that had kept Bobby away from music for so many years. The fear of not being good enough, of starting something new as an adult, of being vulnerable and imperfect in front of others. "I'm 43 years old," Patricia said. "I've never played an instrument in my life. And I'm 72 and relearning things I forgot half a century ago," Bobby countered. "Age is just one more excuse we tell ourselves when we're scared." Emma stood up from the piano bench. "Try it, Mom, just for a minute, see how it feels." Patricia walked slowly to the piano, her movements tentative. She sat on the bench beside her father, and Bobby gently took her hand and placed it on the keys. "This is middle C," he said softly. "Everything starts from here." He showed Patricia a simple scale, playing it first himself and then guiding her fingers through the same pattern. Patricia's playing was halting and uncertain, nothing like Bobby's or even Emma's, but there was something beautiful about watching her try. Emma saw her mother's face shift from skepticism to concentration to something like wonder as she successfully played through the scale for the first time. "It sounds different than I expected," Patricia said. "I thought it would feel more mechanical, but there's something almost emotional about it, even just playing these simple notes." "That's because music is emotional," Bobby said. "Even scales, even exercises. It's all about connecting your inner experience to the sound you create." He played a simple melody, just a few notes that somehow conveyed sadness and longing. The same notes can say different things depending on how you play them. Patricia tried to copy what he had played, and while her version was much simpler and less nuanced, Emma could hear her mother trying to put feeling into it. "I think I understand now," Patricia said. "Why you loved it so much, why giving it up hurt so badly." Bobby nodded. "Music is one of the few things that lets you express what words can't. It's a language that speaks directly to emotion, bypassing all the rational defenses we put up." Over the next several months, the Richardson living room became a space of music and learning. Patricia started taking beginner lessons, working through simple pieces while Bobby and Emma tackled more advanced repertoire. They established a routine where they would all practice individually and then come together to share what they were working on, offering encouragement and feedback to each other. Bobby's re-entry into the music world was not without challenges. His old motorcycle club friends were confused, and some were even hostile about his decision to pursue music seriously. Several of them accused him of abandoning his identity as Ironside, of betraying the life they had all built together. Bobby weathered these criticisms with quiet determination, explaining that he wasn't abandoning anything, but rather reclaiming a part of himself he had lost. Eventually, Bobby did leave the motorcycle club, though he maintained friendships with a few members who understood and supported his choice. He threw himself fully into his studies at the university, taking music theory, piano performance, and music history classes alongside students 50 years younger than him. Some of his classmates were skeptical at first, but Bobby's dedication and obvious passion won most of them over. 6 months after the talent show, Emma participated in a student recital at Mrs. Chen's studio. She played a Chopin waltz that she had been working on with both Mrs. Chen and her grandfather, and while she still made small mistakes, her performance had a depth and musicality that it wouldn't have had before. When she finished, Bobby was on his feet applauding, his face showing the pride that he had never been able to express when he was younger and more guarded. After the recital, several parents approached Bobby to ask about his own musical background. He told them his story truthfully, about the scholarship to Juilliard he had turned down, about the 50 years he had spent running from music, about finding his way back to it through watching his granddaughter play. Some of them asked if he would consider teaching, but Bobby declined, saying he was still relearning too much himself to teach others. Maybe someday, he told them, but right now I'm still a student, still figuring out who I am as a musician at this stage of my life. A year after that conversation in the auditorium, Bobby gave his first public performance in over 50 years. It was just a small recital at the university, one of many student performances that happened throughout the semester. He played a Mozart sonata and a piece by Debussy, and while his technique wasn't perfect, there was something powerful about watching a 73-year-old man share music he had kept hidden for most of his life. Emma and Patricia sat in the audience, watching Bobby navigate the pieces with care and obvious feeling. When he finished, the applause was warm and genuine. Bobby stood and bowed, and Emma saw tears running down his weathered cheeks. These weren't tears of regret or sadness, though. They were tears of relief, of finally stepping out of the shadow of his own fear. After the performance, Bobby joined Emma and Patricia in the lobby. "How did it feel?" Emma asked. Bobby thought about it. "Like I finally came home," he said. "Like I finally stopped running from myself and just stood still long enough to remember who I actually am." Patricia hugged her father tightly. "I'm proud of you, Dad. Not just for playing tonight, but for having the courage to try again." "I learned that from Emma," Bobby said, looking at his granddaughter with affection. "She showed me that courage isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and doing it anyway." Emma smiled. "You taught me the same thing. You showed me that it's never too late to try, never too late to become who you were meant to be." The three of them walked out of the university together, 3 generations of the same family who had all learned the same essential lesson, that the things we run from are often the things that define us, and that coming home to ourselves requires the greatest courage of all. Bobby never did become a professional pianist, never achieved the career he might have had if he had accepted that scholarship at 18. But he continued to study and practice, continued to perform in small recitals, and most importantly, continued to share his love of music with his daughter and granddaughter. He taught Emma for the next several years, helping her develop into a skilled and expressive pianist who eventually did attend a prestigious music school, though not Juilliard. Patricia progressed more slowly, treating piano as a hobby rather than a calling, but she found joy in the learning process and in the connection it gave her with her father. The years of distance between them gradually healed as they found a common language in music, a way to communicate that transcended the complicated history of their relationship. As for Bobby, he often reflected on the cost of his 54 years away from music, the lost opportunities, the unexplored potential, the life he might have lived. But he also came to understand that his journey, while painful, had led him to a different kind of wisdom. He had learned that identity is not fixed, that courage can be found at any age, and that it is never too late to stop running from yourself and start walking toward the person you were always meant to be. The biker who had spent most of his life on the road finally found his way home, not to a place, but to himself. And in doing so, he gave his granddaughter the greatest gift he could offer. The example of someone who had the courage to try again, to risk failure, and to embrace the thing he loved even after decades of denial. That gift, more than any technical instruction or musical insight, was what truly changed Emma's life and set her on a path to become not just a better pianist, but a braver person. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.